as the economy continues to trudge along, a slowdown or the sluggishness, as some people have described it, how is this going to be reshaping the global trade dynamics?
It's a complicated time for global trade right now. You have the largest economy in the world, the US, essentially pulling back from the rules of the game that have governed international trade for a long time. And we've seen President Donald Trump basically disrupting the global trade system by putting up a variety of barriers, tariffs, and other sorts of barriers. Now, normally one might argue that given how beneficial trade has been to the rest of the world, we could see a reconfiguration of trade with China, Europe, Japan, and many other countries banding together to essentially sideline the US. But at the moment, there is this complicating factor that the rest of the world, other than the US and China, is terrified about this twofold problem it faces. US tariffs on the one hand, and this huge excess capacity in China. So practically every economy around the world is concerned about being swarmed by Chinese exports. And we've seen many of them starting to put up barriers to importing from China. So that is going to have, a significant effect in terms of reshaping the global landscape, but not quite in the way one might have thought, with essentially the rest of the world lining up with China on one side. So it's essentially going to be countries going it on their own, perhaps through building relatively modest regional alliances that could generate more free trade within narrow geographical areas. So overall, I see trade becoming much more fragmented. Given the overall benefits of trade, I don't think we're going to see a slump in the overall volume of trade, but certainly in terms of the reorientation of trade through this fragmentation, we are already seeing moves afoot.
Trump has accused China of violating the trade deal. China's Commerce Ministry has come out this morning saying it has taken seriously and strictly implemented and actively upheld the consensus that was reached in the Geneva talks. What do you make of the latest development between the two countries?
We are certainly not out of the woods when it comes to the very complicated relationship between these two countries. It's a very positive sign, in my view, that the two countries have finally gotten around to negotiating. But certainly, we are at a stage where recriminations are still flying between the two countries. There is clearly a lack of trust between the two countries, and the fact that we haven't seen any further discussions between the two countries is quite worrying, because the nature of the relationship between these two largest economies in the world ultimately is going to affect the global trading system and have effects on practically every other country. My view is that there is potentially a way to a grand bargain where essentially China is able to give the US a win of some sorts by bundling together not just trade-related issues, but also arguing that it is making progress on limiting the flow of fentanyl and other illicit drugs to the United States. And these are things that Trump clearly cares about. But the problem is that Trump seems to be shifting the goalposts as he goes along. And so long as he stays fixated on the bilateral goods trade deficit, forgetting about the services trade surplus that the US runs with China and many other countries, it's going to be a very complicated negotiation. I think the hope that many of us had about 2 or 3 weeks ago during the Geneva talks and in the aftermath, that there might be a de-escalation, I think there is a lot more to worry about this at this stage, that we might see a rekindling of the trade tensions between the two countries.
I want to get your take on the de-dollarization trend and the fact that China, since March, they had reduced their exposure to US Treasuries. The holdings of those Treasuries, of course, have now declined $765 billion as of March. What do you make of that?
I think some of that is real, because practically every central bank around the world that holds a large amount of reserves is trying to diversify and limit its exposure to geopolitical and financial risks. Certainly having more than half of a central bank's reserves in one asset class or in one currency, i.e. the dollar, certainly doesn't make sense from a pure diversification perspective. And now if you layer on top of that geopolitical risks with reserves being frozen or limited in other ways in terms of their use, certainly there is good reason for central banks to want to diversify. But I don't think we should make too much of the very substantial apparent decline in China's holdings of US Treasuries. We've seen a significant uptick in the amount of reserves apparently held by other financial centers like the United Kingdom. So given how politically inconvenient it is for China to show a large amount of holdings of US dollar reserves, essentially, we might be seeing China move some of its funds to custodial accounts that are ascribed to other countries that they, like the United Kingdom. It is interesting that if one looks at the overall holdings by official investors, that is mostly central banks and foreign investors of US treasuries, over the last year, that number has actually gone up by a little bit. So we are certainly in a situation where there is a desperate desire for diversification away from the dollar, but with very few alternatives available, especially if you start talking about sums in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I don't think we're going to get a huge shift away from the dollar anytime soon, but at the margin, we are certainly beginning to see some diversification kicking in.